Welcome to the podcast of the Consortium for History of Science, Technology, and Medicine. This episode is the sixth in the Early Career Scholars Workshop Series, which is organized by Barbara Hoff and Clemerio Silva Neto under the auspices of the International Union of History and Philosophy of Science and Technology, the Division for the History of Science and Technology. Today's speaker is Patrick McCray at the University of California in Santa Barbara.
Thanks for joining. Thanks for making the time to listen to whatever bits of wisdom I have to share with you. So for those of you who maybe missed the beginning part of this, the purpose of this is partly to give you some advice and guidance as you are thinking about publishing a book. And you might ask yourself, who is this guy? What does he know? So I can talk, I guess, from a number of perspectives. My experience just writing my own books, my experience reviewing lots of book manuscripts, my experiences editing. I currently edit 2 different book series for Johns Hopkins University Press. And for the last couple of years, I've been on the editorial board of the University of California Press, which is a different thing. And then it's not maybe germane to our discussion today, but if it comes up, I spent a lot of time in the last 20 years working in various capacities as a journal editor or an advisory board or various things like that. And for about 5 years with my colleague Suman Seth at Cornell, we edited the journal Osiris. So that's kind of the sum total of my experience. One of the things I was asked to speak to was, what did you wish I had known before I submitted my first book proposal? So I'm a fairly direct person, and I'll just be perfectly blunt about all this sort of stuff. When I started this process, which was the process of converting a dissertation into a book, I had absolutely no idea what I was doing, and I also had very little guidance to navigate the process. So a lot of what I learned was by trial and error, by making mistakes, which I made quite a few of. And a large part of it was just kind of navigating through my own ignorance. The first book I published was with a small press in the United Kingdom called Ashgate. And I, at the time, just simply didn't understand the differences between presses. I didn't know that there was really a marked difference between this press or that press. I just simply wanted to publish a book. There's a humorous story, although at the time it was not humorous. One of the places that I sent the book manuscript to, ironically, was Johns Hopkins. And there was a very, very long delay, and I finally received a message back from the editor that I was in correspondence with. And there were a couple things. One of them was one of the reader reports was quite blunt in assessing the project and basically said that this project will bring no credit to either the author or the press, which was rather demoralizing. And the second thing, which really surprised me, was the editor at the time at Johns Hopkins, who has since moved on to other things, asked me to pay money for my referee reports. And I had no idea that that was not the standard practice. So I sent some money to Johns Hopkins, and because obviously they need the money. And that was how I got my referee reports. It was only when I was working on the next book project that I realized that that was very, very unusual. That is not how the process works. The funny part of the story is that that book series that I was initially trying to publish with is now the book series that I'm the editor of. So there's probably some sort of moral to draw from that story, but the lesson that I've taken from that is that when I'm interacting with authors or potential authors, especially if they're first-time authors, I try to keep that experience that I had in mind and to make sure that that is not replicated in any fashion, and to try to be as clear and transparent about the process. part of the story for me also is I was very lucky. Um, I published my second book with Harvard University Press, which came out about 20 years ago now. And in this case, again, it was a very unusual experience, which one I don't think many people have, but I had a good relationship with the acquisitions editor, and I'll explain what that means in a minute. And they offered a contract on the basis of just simply submitting a proposal. So I didn't have to submit a manuscript or even any chapters. So again, it was a very unusual kind of experience. And in many ways, it was quite the inverse of the experience that I had with the first book. Before I move on to talk about the process, I will share with you, and I don't know if everyone would say that they have the same experience, but my own secret that I share with a lot of the students that I work with at the University of California when they're thinking about publishing is that in some ways, I think publishing books is easier than publishing articles. And I say this for two reasons. One is that the amount of work that goes into writing an article and submitting it to a journal and going through the review process can be rather lengthy. If you've been through this process, it can take, at least a year and a half, if not longer, between when you submit the manuscript for a journal and when it actually, you're holding it in your hands or you're looking at the PDF online. It's not that books go faster, but if you think about a book as, sort of much more substantial, I think that in some ways that process is easier. But I think the other part that is important to recognize is that the job of a journal editor is to say no. They have so many manuscripts coming in, and a large part of their job is to put manuscripts into the reject pile and to focus with the ones that they can publish. The editor at a press that is going to publish books is in the opposite position. They are called acquisitions editors for a reason. They acquire manuscripts. That is their job. And presses have to publish books because that is their job. So if you have a well-crafted book proposal and a good book idea, in some ways you are pushing a little bit against an open door, because if you are following the steps, and I'll talk about this in the next slide, the pathway is already there, and you're working with a person who is by inclination wanting to accept your project, all things remaining equal, where a journal editor is sort of in the opposite position of weeding things out and saying no. So there is that. So to kind of walk you through the process, and again, this is based on my own experience, but also based on my own time spent working as a book editor. Part of this process is, of course, finding the right press. I don't know the background of all of you that have joined today, but I think you probably have a good sense of presses in your field that you like, that you respect, and that you admire, and that you think publish good books. So that is one place to start. I would probably, if I were just starting from ground zero, I would probably look at my own bookshelf and say, okay, these are the books that I like. Who has published them? What kind of patterns are we seeing there? So once you've kind of identified a press that you think would be a good home for your project, then you start the courtship process of approaching the press and sort of figuring out how this works. And as you know, for many of you maybe who are focusing on converting a dissertation into a book, obviously a dissertation is not a book. They're similar species, but they are not the same species. They're very different. And a dissertation oftentimes doesn't even look like a book in terms of the way in which it's organized or the way in which an argument is presented. But approaching a press, I guess there are a number of ways that I would advise people to do this. On the web pages of presses, whether it's Hopkins or Chicago or Cambridge, if you burrow into the web page, you'll find information about the acquisitions editors and the different fields that they cover, and those would be your primary points of contact. I don't think it is out of the question to approach acquisitions editors and say, you know, I have this project, and to describe that and ask them if they would like to hear more about it. The time in which it takes them to get back to you might be quick, or it might not. That depends on the person, and it depends on the press. Oftentimes also, these acquisitions editors will be at conferences, so whether it's HSS or SHOT or other sort of semi-large conferences that we go to as professionals. That's another way to do that. I think it's probably not a bad idea to contact an editor before time and let him or her know that you would like to find time to meet with them. That way you kind of avoid the awkward conversation in a crowded book room as everybody's standing around with cups of coffee, trying to find and get the attention of a person. So if you actually have time blocked off, even if it's just 15 minutes, that's probably not a bad idea to go. There are occasions where editors will contact potential authors directly. I don't think that happens terribly often with first-time authors, and oftentimes some of these inquiries might be a little suspicious. They might be from presses that are maybe operating on the margins, or are for-profit presses, which operate on a different financial model. I generally steer away from those, and I advise my students to steer away from them. But the acquisitions editor at the press is your main point of contact. And we could talk a little bit about who some of those people are. But the first thing that they will probably ask you about is, you know, do you have a book proposal? And the elements of that are, you know, vary from person to person. But as I look at the many book proposals that come across my desk, I like to see a couple specific parts. One of them is that the proposal should be very clear about what the argument is that you are proposing to make in your book. The proposal should offer an outline of the book. I usually suggest that this is done just by going chapter by chapter. I don't think it needs to be terribly long in terms of that chapter outline. Usually a paragraph or two for each chapter is fine. There is the need to include a section that articulates the significance of the book. You know, why does this book matter? Why would people want to read it? What sort of historiographical questions does it address? There's usually a section in the proposal that lays out the background or the basic story of what this is. So if we think about the way in which this would be organized, I guess I would think, if I look at a proposal, I would include a short 1 or 2 paragraph summary of what the project is at the beginning. I would lay out the historical background. I would include a section then that identifies the significance of what it is that you are hoping to do. I would have a section then that lays out the chapter outline. Then the press will usually want to see something that indicates something about the mechanics of the book. So this is things like, I anticipate this book being 8 chapters, 100,000 words, including notes. You know, you want to specify whether your word count includes notes or not, because there's always that awkward moment, and I can attest to this with experience. I sent my book proposal or book manuscript to the editor I was working with, and they're like, great, you promised us a book that was 100,000 words, but what you sent us is 120,000 words. And I'm like, oh, that's right, because I didn't take the notes into account, you know, beginner's mistake. So specifying that, maybe providing some information about the if you're going to include images and whether these would be in color or black and white. That's important because that affects the cost of the book, but images also take up space in a book. And if you think about an image taking up a full page, that's probably then 300 or 400 words. And if you're going to have 10 or 20 images, you can see then how that starts to eat into your word count. You should probably include a section that, for lack of a better word, I'll call competition. So what are other books that have been published in the field that you are working in that are that you're in dialogue with or that you're in competition with? And then usually something that says something about yourself. And that could just be a short paragraph, I am a blah, blah, blah. I'm at such and such institution, whatever, just so they have a sense of who you are as an author. All told, a book proposal usually comes down to about 10 pages. So you can see there's an awful lot of information to convey in a fairly, very rather brief document. So, this is kind of where I encourage people to be as clear and articulate and as direct as possible with what it is that they want to do, so that by the time I get to the end of the first page, I have a pretty good idea of what this project is about. And then the rest of it is just sort of explaining how that's going to be accomplished. So the acquisitions editor or the book series editor will look at this proposal. They may ask to see sample chapters. In some cases, they may ask to see the entire manuscript. So those are kind of two different pathways. My own personal preference is usually one or two chapters is sufficient for me to see and to feel that that is either good enough or it needs work before, it goes on to the next stages, which we'll say something about. So, assuming by this point that you have a proposal and you have a couple good chapters, clean chapters, ones that are, sufficiently edited and revised to the point where you feel happy about it. Then the next stage is that these then are submitted to the press. Sort of then like a journal article, the proposal and the sample chapters will go out for anonymous review. It's usually anonymous. Sometimes the reviewers will let you know who they are, but it's usually anonymous. A period of time will go by, and this is kind of where the process becomes probably stressful for the author because they're wanting to get feedback right away on what they've submitted. And oftentimes this is where I will hear messages from first-time authors about, why is it taking so long, and what is this process like? And as you all know, reviewers operate on different timelines. There are some people who are exceptionally good and responsible about this and will turn a book proposal or a book manuscript over in a couple of weeks or a month. And then there are those people who are, shall we say, less efficient or less responsible and will take more time. Eventually, you will get that happy and stressful day where you get the reviews from the outside readers. At this point, then the acquisitions editor usually enters the process because, as you can imagine, if you have three different people who are offering you three different perspectives on your book project, you're going to probably have some opinions that are orthogonal to each other. And this is where hopefully the book series editor and the acquisitions editor will step in and communicate with the author to help them reconcile those differing viewpoints. So usually what I advise authors is to get their reviewer response. Don't look at them right away. Take 24 hours, calm yourself down, take a deep breath, and then just systematically go through them as unemotionally as possible. There will definitely be comments in there that will provoke an emotional response, but try to remain as dispassionate about it as possible and to keep a kind of running tab of, reader A wants me to do this, reader B wants me to do that, and to think about ways to reconcile those reports. And then the press will want a response from you, a response about, what your reaction is to those reports. And this is usually the point of what I call reconciliation. How do you take the different advice that you're getting from the different readers as well as the acquisitions editor, and how do you work with that to come up with a pathway to go forward. In writing a response, I always encourage people to, first of all, not to be defensive, and second of all, to accentuate the positive. Look for phrases where the readers are like, well, I don't agree with the author's argument, but this is a beautifully written, well-organized, blah, blah, blah. Focus on that first. Say, as referee A and B says, this is an extremely well-written project. And then in the second paragraph, move on to, however, there clearly are some disagreements about the nature and structure of the argument that I'm making, or a disagreement about the sources or whatever. But it's important to find those points in the referee reports that are positive, to draw attention to them and to indicate to the press and the acquisitions editor that, you know, it's not all bad, that there are positive things there. Then you start the process of making the revisions. And this is where you have the responses from the readers to work with. You have your own sense of how you want these revisions to be. Those revisions are made. The process is repeated, hopefully not more than once, although I've seen this go on sometimes over and over, and that's usually a sign that something is breaking down in the process, and we can talk about that if we want. But at some point then you will get a happy email from your acquisitions editor who says, you know, hooray, we're good. We'd like to issue a contract for this. And that's kind of where the, as I say, where the fun part begins. Contracts that come from the press are usually about 10 to 12 pages long. They have lots of legalistic language. If you're legalistically inclined, I suppose you could hire a lawyer to look at it. I've never done that. A lot of it is fairly straightforward, boilerplate stuff that you will see in every single book contract. The things to look for in that are to make sure that you and your editor are in agreement about the word count, and to make sure that it's very clear about the word count, and that includes the notes or doesn't include the notes, and how many images and that sort of stuff. There'll be something in there about the date in which they expect to receive the final manuscript from you. Acquisitions editors are realists, and they understand that deadlines are squishy. But again, I think it's good to remain in communication with your editor contact if you're going to be significantly late on delivering the final manuscript. I'm a firm believer that open, transparent communication is always better, and that reminding your acquisitions editor that you still exist, that this project is still alive, is also not a bad thing to do. There might be some language in the contract, if you are fortunate, about a book advance. This is money that is paid to you at various stages in the process. Book advances can vary tremendously, from just maybe a few $1,000s to $15,000 or $20,000 or more if it's a trade press, but that's a different creature. We can talk about that if we want later on. Usually book advances are divided into kind of milestones. So maybe you get the first half of the advance on signing the contract, and then the second half on delivering the final manuscript. There may be no advance at all. It just depends. Once you've signed all that and everybody's happy with that, you have your contract. You then move to finishing the manuscript, getting the final version, sending it off to the press, and then your book goes into production. And production is a long process. It can take upwards of a year. Number of different stages in that process. You have to secure the image rights for any, secure the permissions for any images that you're going to include. This is where I would advise people to try to be as organized as possible, maybe keep a spreadsheet or something of, okay, I have 10 images. These are the places that I have to contact to get permission, and then keep a running tab on where those are in the various stages of getting permission. I've worked with book projects where the press has taken the responsibility for getting the image permissions, but I wouldn't hold your breath and expect that to happen. This is probably something that you would have to do. Then at some point you will get a large file back from the press, which are your copy edits. This is basically the press having sent your manuscript out to a copy editor, and they've gone through and have cleaned up the language, maybe corrected typos. Perhaps they're suggesting places where the wording and the phrasing could be done much better or more clearly. The quality of copy editors varies from press to press. I don't want to say anything negative about certain presses, but there are certain presses that are not so good at this. And there are ones, for example, I work, the last couple of projects I've done have been with MIT Press, and I happily send presents to my copy editor because they are amazing. They are not only a good copy editor, but in at least a couple instances, this person I have worked with, not only have they fixed mistakes that I have made, because they also, in this case, will do some fact checking, but in one very notable case, they said, oh, in the process of looking at this, I noticed this one other thing. And in a sense, they had found like this little corner of research that I had totally missed. And I was like, this is the best thing ever. Not only have you cleaned up my muddy prose in places and fixed all of my typos, but you've actually found a little research nugget that I didn't even know existed. So, thank you very much. You finish with the copy edits, those go back to the press. And then a couple months later, what I think is probably the most exciting thing is you actually get your page proofs. This is where now it actually looks like a book. And opening up that file, I always find quite enjoyable because, it's typeset and it looks like a book. At this point, you can't make any substantive changes to the project. You can insert a few words or characters there, but by this point, they have typeset it, they have the page numbers assigned. If you really, really want to make your editor angry, you will say things like, oh, I think I want to revise my introduction or whatever, at which point they will probably tell you in no uncertain terms that that is a very, very bad idea and that we are not going to do that, and highly not recommended. I did have a colleague in my department who was publishing their first book, and for reasons that remain unknown to me, decided at the page proof stage that she wanted to completely rewrite her book introduction. The book eventually got published, but it was substantially delayed, and I think it's fair to say that a lot of goodwill was lost in the process. So definitely not advised. It's also at this stage that you will start to be getting messages from the promotional or publicity department of the publisher, and they will be asking you for things, and there's usually a standard questionnaire to fill out. So there will be things like, what are the conferences at which we should display your book? What are the journals that we should send copies of your book to have it reviewed? Who are people that would be good to write promotional blurbs that go on the back of the book? You'll also be asked to do, and I find this personally very difficult, to write a description of your book in 50 words, 100 words, and 250 words. These are the kinds of things that go on the dust jacket, that go into the book catalog, that go onto Amazon or what have you. It's difficult because this is your project and you are so close to it, and being asked to describe your own book in 75 words is challenging. So this, at least for me, is oftentimes the thing that I dread the most, and that it takes me a fair amount of time to do that. And this is probably a bad analogy, but I often say that this process of production, this is a bad analogy, but I'll go with it. It's a little bit like getting divorced. It takes a very, very long time, and there are distinct moments in the process that have to happen right away. And then there are long periods of time where you're like, nothing's happening. Maybe a more positive way of thinking about it. It's like buying a house, maybe is a better way of you find a house and then you put money down and then long periods of time go by and then all of a sudden you have to have a house inspection done and you have to get insurance or whatever. And those sorts of things like have to happen immediately and then like nothing happens for a period of time. So anyway, these are just analogies that I have, which probably say more about me than more than you need to know about, but in any case. And then finally, you get a book. Yay. And this is exciting, although if your temperament is like mine, by the time you actually get your book, it's a little bit anticlimactic because you get this box that arrives that is the 10 pounds representing all of the work that you've done over the last 5 to 10 years and all of the work that you've done with the promotion and the editing and all of that. And then you open it up and it's this book, but it's yours and you've created this sort of thing. But then this also means that there are processes involved with promotion and publicity and giving talks, whether in person or over Zoom. I think it is fair to say that there has never been an author that I've met who has been completely satisfied with the promotion and publicity of the press that they're working with. Everybody is dissatisfied. Everybody feels that their book has never gotten enough attention and that something could have been done more. I guess I've seen this enough times just personally and then working with authors to realize that this is just the state of humankind and we're just never going to be happy. Go figure. But there are certain things that you can do as an author to promote your book. There are probably various social media strategies and things like that, but that's probably outside the scope of what we're talking about today. And then finally, to kind of bring this long monologue, and thank you for your patience, to a close, some of the variables that I guess that I would put out there, as you're thinking about a press to work with, do you go with a book series? I think there are values that or advantages to doing that, but I can also think that there are reasons why it doesn't really matter in the current publishing environment. There are definitely people who work with developmental editors. These are creatures who will take your book manuscript and will work with you to develop the manuscript, to polish the prose, to smooth out language, to help with your organization and things like that. This costs a fair amount of money. There are, it is a profession that people are engaged with, that they will work with these people. That's sort of up to you as to whether or not you want to do that. This is kind of where I begin to see, especially for PhD students or postdocs, where you begin to see a bit of a disparity between people who have the financial ability to do this, perhaps through their institutions, and those who don't, or people who choose to spend that money and do that process. But I think if you're looking at a developmental editor who charges a couple dollars per page and your book manuscript is 500 pages, you can see how this can quickly add up. And then we can talk, if we wish, down the road about edited collections. That again is kind of a different creature. This is not the single author monograph, but this is a person who is bundling together a bunch of essays from their friends and their colleagues around a particular theme or a particular topic and producing those.
Thanks a lot. That was really good. I hope you hear me. There was just an interruption in my connection. Sorry. So this was really great. I think a good overview. I think one thing is also nice to mention. I was just thinking because you recently published a book and I reviewed that book. It's not to announce that, but also I think if you write a book, it's also nice to think about potential reviewers or reviewer communities. But don't ask, we had the discussion at the beginning of the workshops, don't ask people directly, but probably suggest it to journals. And so the book actually gets read. I think it's really important if it's your first book. that you have certain amount of review also in the pipeline or prepared. Okay, so there is the first question is, if I already have a manuscript of a short book, should I already send the whole of it?
Okay. Well, no matter what you have in terms of a manuscript, you're going to need to write a proposal. So, congratulations on having a finished manuscript. That's great. But you'll need to prepare a proposal, because that is what most presses are going to want to see. They're going to want to see not just ta-da, this thing that you have produced, but they're going to want to see a way or how you are articulating what the book is about, what its argument is, what your vision of it is in terms of words and competition and significance and that sort of thing. So I guess my answer is, you have half of the puzzle there by having the manuscript, but then you're still going to need to produce a proposal.
So, how do you extend a long article into a short book, or a short book into a long book? Is it even a good idea? I'm also wondering. So, if I have an article, should I make it a book?
I think it's a weird article that becomes a book. If you think about them, and this kind of goes back to my idea of, in part, why I think books are easier to write than articles. I mean, obviously, the amount of time that goes into them is substantially different, and I recognize that. But I think of an article as something where you have to be very economic with your words and your thoughts. An article exists to make one specific point, maybe two, but by that point, then you're starting to maybe be writing two articles. Where a book has a much more expansive, it just encompasses more of a landscape or more territory, if you will. So you can allow yourself these digressions and going down pathways and things like that you can't do in an article. I mean, if we think about it, look at a typical article in ISIS, for example. I mean, it's its own particular genre. It has a particular format. It's sort of like a symphony that always has four movements. You have the opening introduction, that somewhere in the first page, there's going to be the footnote that goes on for half a page, where every single bit of historiographical connection is noted. Then there'll be something in that introduction that will lay out, this is what I'm going to do in this article. And then in the next three sections, you do those things, and then you have a conclusion. I mean, there's a formula for writing articles. Books allow you to break out of that formula and be more creative, but they also allow you to get away from that model where I just am going to say this one thing, and I'm going to be very clear and direct and articulate with how I say it. So, but again, don't misunderstand me. I'm not saying that a book allows you to be unorganized and sprawling and chaotic. I'm just saying that it gives you a lot more latitude and flexibility in terms of what you are writing. In terms of how you take a long or a short book and turn it into a long book, I mean, I think that depends what we're talking about in terms of short and long. Books tend to be 50,000 words or more. Again, I'm thinking of very short books. I mean, one of the ones that comes to mind is kind of a classic from the 1990s, which, very much dates me, but it's David Mindell's book that he wrote about technology and ironclad ships in the Civil War. And that book is probably, as published, I don't have a copy here, but 120 pages. I mean, it's very, very succinct. But I think typically books are going to be in the neighborhood of 80 to 120,000 words. I think there's a point where if it starts to go above a certain number, you'll probably have to convince the press that it's worth it, because one of the major costs in publishing a book is the materiality of it, the paper. Strangely enough, it still matters how many pages it is. That contributes to the cost. But it also functions into what or how much the press can sell it for. So obviously, the longer the book is, the more the press will have to charge for it. But again, there are different economies here, a lot of which are black boxes to me, even as a person who's written many books. I don't always understand the economics of it. It is also a function of how the press imagines marketing your book. If they're going to imagine marketing it purely for an academic audience, or do they imagine it having some crossover appeal to other areas of the history profession, or even to outside readers or other disciplines? That's kind of where it begins to vary case by case. And I realize that's a very, very long answer to what was a very simple question, but those things become rather complex very quickly. And there also are questions for which there's not a one size fits all answer. So that's the best I can do.
Okay, thanks. We just now move to another one, which is a long question. I think we can kind of summarize it as how should the content be organized so as to become a book? I would think of this as if someone has a dissertation, because you already mentioned that. How do you make it a book? So how do you organize a book?
Okay. Yeah, that's a tricky one. It's tricky because I'm trying to put myself back 30 years when I was doing this for the first time, because having done this a number of times, I understand the process, but I'm trying to think of how one articulates that in a manner that makes sense. And I guess one of the things I guess I would say that I look for when I'm evaluating projects is I want to see that there is a narrative thread that is running from the beginning to the end. What I do not want to see is I have this file that I'm giving you, and it has an introduction and a conclusion, and everything that is in the middle is not connected to each other. That there needs to be some sort of connective tissue that is connecting chapter 1 to chapter 2 to chapter 3. So, to use the cliche phrase, there needs to be some kind of narrative arc. Maybe there's not an arc, maybe it's a line, I don't know, pick your geometric figure. But the point being that there needs to be something that gets me from page 1 to page 300 that I'm following as I go through. It could be a historical actor, it could be an idea, it could be an argument that you're making, but what we tend to not want to see is an introduction and a conclusion and 4 chapters in between that don't really have any conversation between them, or, to put it uncharitably, look like you've just taken 4 articles and shoved them together and then stuck a introduction and conclusion at the end and are calling it a book, because that's not a book. That's a different creature. So as you think about the organization, again, think about what this looks like in the bigger picture. What is the sustaining theme or melody that is going to run through the entire thing that you get on the first couple pages that you come back to at the very end of it? I hope that answers the question. I'm happy to explore that a little bit more if you want, but I'm not sure. It's kind of one of these things that you also learn how to do it by doing it. And that's a very unsatisfying answer, but it is true, unfortunately, or fortunately, depending how you look at it. What else, Barbara?
I think the point about narrative structure is really, I think, the good point to say that that is what matters. So yeah. I think the answer is great. So how to increase the chances that one's book proposal is accepted? Any ideas?
I think identifying a press that is identifying a publisher that fits your project well, and that means doing some research on your part. I'm assuming that a lot of the people here publish in the history of science and technology, and I think we can recognize, just from looking at our own bookshelves, what some of the best presses are in those areas. I mean, obviously not to put pressure on them, but obviously like University of Chicago is one of the top publishers in the field. But that also means that the University of Chicago gets lots of proposals and lots of manuscripts, which is both a blessing and a curse. I think there are also lots of somewhat smaller presses that are hoping to take products away from Chicago and are in competition with them. So there is that aspect as well. But I think the process of making it most likely for your project to get accepted is a pretty obvious one, which is to have a very good, clear, articulate proposal, to workshop it with friends and colleagues, perhaps even people who are not in your field. Because if it's not legible to somebody who doesn't work in the history of science, then it's probably not legible. So it needs to be something that is understandable by a wider community of people. I personally, and this is very much a Patrick thing, I tend not to like projects that are drenched in jargon. I really dislike projects where the author is inventing terms and jargon that is unnecessary. And I really encourage authors, if they're going to invent a term or a piece of jargon, that they very, very clearly define what that is and that they use it consistently throughout the book. It drives me insane to read a book manuscript where the author introduces some fancy term in the introduction and goes on about how it's different from, how their term about, just to use an example, how their term about political technologies is different from technopolitics. And they're going to talk about this, blah, 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 blah. And then they just abandon their concept like a sad orphan child, and they never come back to it until the conclusion. And then they're like, here we are again with my term, my concept. And you're like, but you abandoned it. You you introduced it at the party and then you left it by itself, and then all of a sudden now you're coming back to it. No, if you're going to do that, and here again is my own personal opinion. If you're going to inflict upon the world your own specific piece of STS jargon or whatever, then you need to own it and use it consistently, and not just consistently, but continually throughout the book. Otherwise, the person reading this is like, why did I bother to learn what this thing is? That's a piece of personal preference for mine, but I think it does perhaps point to a larger problem in a book project, that if an author is introducing a term or a concept and they don't return to it, it suggests to me as an editor that maybe the book's organization needs some work. So it's kind of one of these clues that I have of like, well, maybe they haven't thought this through all the way. So it's kind of a diagnostic that I use. So anyway, a personal opinion there, but one from experience.
Yeah, but I think it's a good experience. And I was also thinking about, it's the same if you submit an article and it's just not well organized. You really have to do your homework. Second point about homework, I share that in the chat. I think the best, if you really want to avoid rejection, is to check the dream press you have in mind and see what they expect, what are the expectations. And if you reach them just formally, that's already a good point, because they see that you really want to fit to their press. So it's not just, it doesn't look like random. You really have organized yourself, and that maybe also helps a lot in avoiding rejection, I think.
To add to that, when I'm working with somebody who is, is a first-time author, I have no problem sharing copies of book proposals that I have written with them so they can see the organization and the format. I don't mean to say that my book proposals are like the gold standard and everything needs to look like Patrick's book proposals, but they are examples of successful book proposals. That doesn't mean there are other ways to do it, but this is a model or one example for how it works. I again, just personally, I am a big believer in outlining things. And I think outlining your proposal, outlining your book, whatever method you choose to do that, whether it's one of the various writing programs that people take advantage of, or whether it's my old-fashioned way of having a whiteboard in front of me with sticky notes on it that I can move around, indicating this material goes in this chapter, or this material goes in that chapter. But that's more of a writing thing, less about a publishing thing. But if your book proposal is not well organized and not well structured, it's usually a sign then that your book is probably suffering from the same issues. So, yeah.
Okay, good point. So I'm going to read 2 more questions and then
Okay.
Primero is going to take over. So again, I'm going to summarize a bit because the next question is really about the different roles. So can you tell us more about what is a series editor and maybe a publisher representative? What are their roles a
Okay.
bit in organizing the press work?
Okay. No, that's a good question, because I know I've been using the word editor in a number of different ways. Okay, so I mentioned that I co-edit 2 book series for Johns Hopkins. One of them is a history of technology book series that I co-edit with Asif Siddiqui at Fordham and Kate McDonald at UCSB. So we are the series editor. We're not employees of Johns Hopkins. In fact, we literally get paid nothing by Johns Hopkins. We're doing free work because. Um, so as series editors, people will approach us and say, hey, I have this project, can I send a proposal? I think it would be a good fit for your book series. Like I said, our book series is a history of technology book series. Our job as a series editor is to kind of be the first line the first line or first group of people that reads the proposal, that evaluates it. If we like it, if we think it's a good fit for the series, our next step then is to contact the acquisitions editor at Hopkins that we work with, who is Matt McAdam. Matt is an employee of Johns Hopkins. He works for the press. And we say, hey, Matt, this is a good project. We support it. We'd like to go forward with it. And then Matt takes it from there. Matt's the one who gets the outside reviewers, and he's the main person then that the author works with. We enter the picture at a couple different stages, such as when the referee reports come in, and we intervene at different stages. But our job, I guess, is sort of, to use like a sports metaphor, our job is kind of like talent scouts. We go out there and we work with scholars, or more likely they approach us, and we work with them to help them develop the proposal and get it into shape so then it can go forward. Not everybody has to do that. You can just approach the acquisitions editor directly. So to use Matt as an example, you could just look him up on the Johns Hopkins webpage, get his email. There's probably some information on the Hopkins page about what they want to see in a book proposal. Some publishers are better about this than others. And you could just write Matt and say, dear Matt, my name is Patrick. I have a book project on X, Y, and Z, and and go from there. You may get a response. If it's a responsible acquisitions editor, they will write you back. Not everybody is good about this. As we know, some people are better at answering emails than others. That's life. It's important not to take it personally. It is not the acquisitions editor. No, it's probably just because they're simply overwhelmed, or, sad to say, maybe they're just not terribly well organized, and that's just human nature. But it is important throughout this process, to not take it personally, because it's not personal. It's just, for lack of a better word, it is very transactional. You have a thing. you want to see a thing, you want to see something done with your thing, and the press wants to do something with it, hopefully as well. And that's kind of the meeting ground that you have is really good advice that I can offer. Without getting into the details, I could give you numbers of examples of where this process goes off the rails and it does become personal. But I prefer not to focus on that and kind of keep things more positive. But everybody has bad publishing stories, and the one that I started this presentation with, at least for me, was a really it was not a good one. But you get past it, and there you go. Sorry, Barbara, I'm giving you very long answers. I'll try to be more succinct.
No, but I think it's great to really differentiate between the roles. And I think for everyone here, it's also important to know that you really have to check your own dream press, because there's a huge variation between cultures. If they have acquisition editors, series editors, and so on. So be really clear with whom you talk, with whom you interact, and who is the responsibility and what is this person for, before even starting the process. And it's really important that you see that there are difference between presses, between cultures, and so on. So I think that's just to add, I think. So one question, and then Climerio takes over because it's increasing number here. So in case one has an interdisciplinary approach to a certain topic, how can find one a book publisher?
I guess that depends how interdisciplinary we're talking about. I mean, if it's a book that is combining like, genetics with the history of science, I mean, those are two very different things. If it's something that's combining two different fields in history, that's a little more manageable, I think. I think it's difficult. I can't really answer that question. That would be more on a case-by-case basis. But I just know personally, as working as a book series editor, if somebody submits a book project and it's combining historical and sociological methods or something, that's fine. I think I probably might encourage them to do maybe more of one than the other, or to be more clear about how these different disciplines are speaking to each other, both in terms of the literature that they're engaging with, but also the methods. But I don't think that is, it's certainly not a deal breaker. And there are certainly many fine examples of work in our fields that are, interdisciplinary. Just two things, I guess, Barbara's question reminded me of this. I mean, I think one of the best things that you can do as you're an author approaching this is also just to look closely at your own bookshelves and to think about, like, what are the books that you like as an author? And why do you like those books? What makes them stand out to you? Is it the way it's written? Is it the organization? Is it the materiality of the book and you just like how it looks? Maybe, like, what is it about it, that thing, that makes it one of your favorite books? And then maybe think about how you can use that as a model in terms of organization and writing, or to emulate that. And then kind of the other thing, going back to what I was saying about dealing with acquisitions editors. I mean, I understand nobody wants to be that person who's always, writing and saying, did you get my message? But I mean, I think it's fair at some point that if you write an acquisitions editor and you don't get a reply for more than a month, to write them back and just say, politely, hey, I'm just following up on this. I do think that this is one of those areas where being direct and self-confident, and also very forthright about this, helps a lot. I certainly would never be offended if someone sent me something and for whatever reason I forgot about it, or I didn't get to it, and they wrote me and they said, hey, any thoughts on that thing that I sent you? I would probably feel very embarrassed, and I would probably write back immediately. And I think most people want to do the right thing, and sometimes you have to poke them a little bit to get that response. But I think there's a certain value in not being shy. I think the worst thing you can do is to throw your book proposal over the fence to an acquisitions editor And then if you don't hear, just say, oh, well, they clearly don't like my project and they don't like me and I'm done with them. They are, you know, that press is dead to me. That's probably not a healthy attitude.
Absolutely right. Good point. I think one thing that I would like just to simply add is you talked about the bookshelf thing. Also the author, I think it's also good to check the authors that model your writing, even if you consider it interdisciplinary and a novel approach, which is absolutely great. But still, there are people in the field, so check the book series they've published with, and also just ask them. Send a kind email, very brief, and ask them for advice. It sometimes helps. Even like people in the same interdisciplinary field, ask them for advice. It's just worth an effort. One short email, and then maybe that helps.
I absolutely agree. I mean, you know, if any of you know me personally, I am one of these people who is like pathological about answering email. I mean, I usually answer emails within 24 hours, if not sooner, because it drives me insane to look at my inbox and see a bunch of emails. That's just me. I realize not everybody does that, and that's fine. But if people contact me and ask me for advice about publishing, I will answer those messages. I will try to help people, largely from the point of view that when I was starting this process 30 years ago, you know, for a number of reasons, I didn't have anyone helping me with that. And I think it's my responsibility as someone who's been working in the field now for 25 years to fix that and to make it a better process for other people so they don't have the experience that I did. And, you know, that doesn't mean that it'll always be perfect, but at least that's my goal.
Thank you very much, Patrick. I think as a field, we all have benefited from advices, right? And most of my colleagues and people I interact with, they'll be happy to give feedback and to help, especially early career scholars. So, and I also really like this idea of having the clear who are your role models, like it will help you to think of how your writing style, and also I think it's interesting the strategy Barbara suggested before. Can just emphasize again. I think once you decide which is your dream press, I think it's important to also identify some books in this press that you really like, and because usually books are shaped between the author and the editors, right? So this process also makes the book closer to the idea of books in the press and the models of books in the press. So now I'd like to move on to some couple of questions about the dissertations and how you turn your book into dissertation. So like you defended your PhD dissertation and you want to turn into a book. What is the first steps you take towards that direction? So one specific question this is regarding the literature review. Like what is the difference between the literature review that goes into a dissertation and a book? And one more, like, this is about the book proposal. When you're also making this cut for the book proposal, how long should it be, the literature review and the book proposals?
Okay. So one of the first things I would advise anybody who's going to turn a dissertation into a book is set it aside for 6 months. Do something else. By the time you finish your dissertation, you're too close to it. You can't see it anymore, and give it a rest. Do something else. The other thing I would recognize is dissertations and books have different audiences. The dissertation, at least in the United States, is something that's probably written for half a dozen people, if you're lucky. It is written for a specific purpose, to demonstrate to your department and to your committee members that you have earned a doctorate degree. And in that sense, it is very instrumental. It's an instrument to allow you to achieve a certain goal. And in that dissertation, you have to demonstrate things like, look at this vast body of literature that I have mastered. And I'm going to tell you about every single bit of that literature that I have read. And I'm going to put it in the text probably of what I am writing. And there'll be these long historiographical essays and things like that, or sections in your dissertation. That's fine. Generally speaking, in a book, in the text of a book, you don't want to see that. You're not writing for 6 people, you're writing for 600 or 6,000 people. It's a different audience. So you need to keep the differing kinds of audiences in mind, with the idea that with the dissertation, you're writing for a very, very narrow group of people. And with the dissertation, ideally, you are trying to write for a much broader group of people. So communicating in a book manuscript, and I'll come back to the book proposal thing in a minute, you know, an extensive section in the introduction where you go on for pages and pages about how Javier did this one and Convin wrote this piece and Philip wrote this thing or whatever. Shove all that stuff into a footnote, and be concise with it. I would kind of work with the assumption that if I pick up a book and I read it, I'm going to assume that the author has done some research and knows what they're talking about. I don't need to be convinced of that fact in the text, in the main body of what it is that I'm reading. I find that stuff just gets in the way. Other people may have differing opinions, but that is mine. In terms of having a giant literature review or having a literature review in the book proposal itself, I guess I would probably frame that in maybe with a less academic term of maybe as like a background section or other related books, something like that. But I think if I'm reading a book proposal and I imagine this thing only being 10 pages, devoting 2 or 3 full pages to a historiographical review in the proposal itself seems unnecessary. I think there are ways that you can gesture to that by highlighting a few key works that your project engages with and just leaving it at that. And when it comes to the manuscript itself, it'll be a little more obvious in the manuscript what the larger conversation and literature is that you are in dialogue with. And again, I think that idea of identifying who your audience is and being clear about that in the proposal. I mean, are you writing this just for the 150 people in the world who care about the history of quantum mechanics? Or are you writing for a broader community of people who are interested in, you know, history of science in the 20th century and the differing ways that you're going to engage with that? And that's for, you know, you to work with your acquisitions editor and yourself and your friends and your colleagues to figure that out. But I think audience is a key thing. And then also, I think it's really important to be as clear and direct as possible. What is the conversation that your book is part of? And maybe it is people in the history of science. Maybe it's people, again, going back to that interdisciplinary question of people in other fields that you want to bring into that conversation. But I think framing it in terms of audience and conversation, I think that's useful language as an author to deploy, of imagining your book as part of an ongoing conversation and thinking about who you want to have as part of that dialogue.
Thank you very much, Patrick. I think it's really important. This mention on history of quantum physics, it's quite timely because it's quite a small community, really, and it's one of the challenges people face is like once they form this small community, how to reach out to a broad audience and to engage with broader topics. Yes, it's quite a challenging question. So now I have quite specific question, but I think it's very interesting. It's about like from my PhD dissertation, I published some articles. Then I wanted to turn the dissertation into a book. Or in general, I have like a set of articles, and I want to bund them together into a book. How does editors respond to this? How does universities, how the presses usually respond to this?
At this case, I'm going to limit my response to what I know more about presses in the United States, because that tends to be my experience. I know that different presses in different national contexts approach these things differently. My experience is that if you are hoping to bundle some articles together and call it a book, that's usually not a good idea. Again, going back to this idea of there needing to be a connecting thread that runs from the beginning to the end is essential, that there needs to be a clearly identified historical actor or unit of analysis that you are carrying from the beginning to the end. But also, if you imagine a publisher and you say, hey, I have these 4 articles that I've published already, and I will write another one, but this will be my book. The publisher is going to be like, well, you've already published it. I mean, what do you want from us? It's already out there. And it's already out there for free, which it makes it even worse. So like, what's the added value that you're bringing to us by putting it between 2 pieces of cardboard? So not to be, well, I am being very blunt about it, but that becomes a problem. That having been said, there are certainly presses in Europe and other countries that will be happy to do this. But these also might be presses that publish these things for profit and charge astronomical prices for those products. Those presses operate on a very different economic model. And when I see a press that publishes a 200-page book and wants to charge me 120 pounds for it, I have a certain one-finger salute that I give to those presses. And I also refuse to review manuscripts or proposals for those presses because they're operating for a profit. I have the luxury, I guess, to be able to do that, but I recognize not everybody does. But I guess I kind of view that as a predatory side of publishing, and I just don't want to participate in that.
I think you just mentioned something I want to add to that, because you really talk about politics behind publishing and also how that is related to the context, because exactly what you mentioned, like in some countries you have to publish your dissertation kind of as soon as possible to get your doctoral degree to stay on the market. So the Germans suffer, I would say, a lot from this concept, because they really have to publish as soon as possible. So this is really one thing that people need to take into account, and I think everyone needs to decide for themselves how they want to navigate in this. But I think I agree, it's very problematic. Yes.
I agree, and again, I'm showing my own national parochialism by focusing primarily on my experiences working within the context of the United States, and then a little bit with some British presses. But I understand the economics and the politics for people in Germany or other countries is very different, and I can't necessarily speak to that, but I just finished teaching a graduate seminar in the history of technology, and one of the things that I did with my students was we read a series of books, but some of them were by first-time authors. And, I would say, look, here are 2 examples of a dissertation that's been turned into a book. Let's talk about what this looks like in terms of the actual organization and structure of the book. And, in some cases, the dissertation has been camouflaged and there's a nice facade around that where you don't see the infrastructure so much of the dissertation. And then there are other ones where it's like really obvious that there wasn't a lot of remodeling that went on between the dissertation and the book. And sometimes that becomes a little problematic. But there was one example that I can think of, a recent book that came out on the electrification of Mexico. And again, this was a dissertation turned into a book. But the difference between the dissertation and the book is tremendous. And that's a wonderful example of making that transformation from one product to another, and other examples that were maybe a little less ambitious or less successful in that remodeling process.
I would like to follow up with a question about this national context and difference. Like the one question here was if you can see difference between North American and European publishers in this.
Well, I mean, I guess it just again goes back to my own personal experience, which I have much more familiarity working with, California, Yale, Princeton, Chicago, Harvard, Oxford, Cambridge. I mean, probably those are like the top 10 presses that and Pittsburgh would be another one, Rutgers, maybe some smaller university presses like Oklahoma, Nebraska, but by and large, the space, obviously Hopkins, sorry, just completely forgot about them. But, obviously presses that are based primarily in the United States, and Oxford and Cambridge kind of being the weird hybrids because they ostensibly are in the UK, but they have, an extensive footprint, in the United States as well. So those are the ones that I just have the most experience with.
So I just continue to pick one because we are getting close to the end. So, how early in the process should or can I approach an acquisition editor? I have a book proposal, but no presentable chapter yet. Can I still already approach an acquisition editor with my book idea and so on, or only when it's finished?
I think that kind of depends on the author's personality. I think if someone were to approach me and say, look, I have this idea for a book, here's the proposal, I would read it and say, yeah, okay, this seems interesting. I think this is something that we might be interested in. Why don't you, I'll make a note of this. I'll keep a file on my computer about it. But why don't you then contact us when you have a couple clean chapters to share, because we're going to need those before we move on to the next step. I would say that especially for first-time authors. I mean, if it was somebody who's published half a dozen books and is like, hey, I have this proposal, then I probably would think about it a little differently, because I'd be like, okay, this person has a track record. They've already established themselves, as a reliable or not reliable author. They already have a history. And then I would probably think about it differently. But if it was a first-time author, I would be certainly happy to read the proposal. I would kind of give it like a thumbs up, this sounds great, or yeah, this isn't really for us, but maybe you should try that press or this press, because that seems like a better home for it. But if it's something we're interested in, sounds great, keep in touch. But let us know once you have a couple chapters, is kind of how I would deal with that situation.
Someone is asking about the difference of approaching a book editor and the journal editor. And I think for me, it's maybe important to stress the difference between the review process, like is it blind, is it not blind, and things like that. So what is the difference between a journal editor and a book editor in this regard?
Yeah, I mean, journal editors, you tend not to have it tends not to be a long-lasting personal relationship. You have an article that you want to get published. Here's a journal. Oftentimes you don't even, you usually don't send it directly to the editor. You usually have some sort of god-awful internet portal that you have to submit it through. And, it can be a very, frankly, a very depersonalizing and anonymous kind of experience. I know that like the previous editors of ISIS, Matt and Alex, I think maybe, I think certain journals have a reputation for interacting a little more closely with authors. But I think that the process of working with an acquisitions editor at a press, because the time from here's my idea to here's my book is longer and goes through more steps. I think it's a more personal relationship. And I think also, if it's a good relationship, you, as an author, if you have a good experience, you're probably going to come back to that acquisitions editor in that press. If you have a good experience with Chicago or Cambridge or, whatever press, you will then come back to them with your second project or your third project. In fact, there will probably be some sort of legalistic language in the contract that says that the press has the right of first refusal for your next project. That's something for you to figure out as an author, whether you're comfortable with that or not. I don't know the degree to which presses actually enforce that. I mean, I've never heard of anybody being taken to small, having a legal action filed against them because they neglected that one particular section of their contract, which is not to say I'm encouraging you to do that, because that would be bad legal advice. But, presses are not going to like come after authors. Again, if you're missing your deadline by 2 months, or you're over your word count by 20, I mean, these tend not to become areas of litigation. These tend to be gentle person agreements in many ways that have to be codified in the form of a contract. Just personal experience, just to show you that sometimes people don't learn anything. I just finished a book for MIT Press. I told them that the book would be 90,000 words. When I submitted the final manuscript, it was 150,000 words. I obviously went substantially over my word count. Obviously, the press was not happy with me. We had lots of back and forth, and we agreed on a compromise number somewhere between those. This was just me during the pandemic getting carried away with a book project and thinking that the press wouldn't care, and being reminded that at the end of the day, they actually do care. And that a book that is 50% longer than you told them it was going to be is bad advice. Don't do that. But there are rooms for negotiation and compromise in these things, and that's as much as I guess I could say on the contract side of things.
Okay, so just brief answer to this, if possible. The question is, but can you say more about proposals for edited volumes? What is specific? How are they different? So if
edited volumes are challenging. I mean, the general conventional wisdom is that presses don't like to do them because they're hard to market. But at the same time, if we look at our bookshelves, we have lots of edited. I mean, so clearly there's like this weird disjoint there, because clearly people buy them and we use them for teaching and what have you. I think it's just that the market for those is very different. I mean, it's rare that you're going to see an edited volume, reviewed in like the New York Review of Books or something like that, which is kind of like a place where, all presses want to get their books into the TLS or the London Review of Books, or, pick whatever, magazine that you want to see. But I mean, the proposal is somewhat similar. I mean, this is the book. These are who the authors are going to be. This is their contributions. This is why, so the form of the proposal looks very similar. I think you probably will have a little bit more of a challenge in convincing a press to go with it. But that having been said, I mean, edited volumes appear all the time. I mean, we just finished one for Hopkins earlier this year, and there wasn't much pushback from the press about that. So, but again, I think it's one of these things where we clearly identified, this is what it is about. This is what the argument is. This is a bundle of 12 different essays from 12 different well-established authors that are all contributing to a larger argument and a larger narrative thread, rather than it being like my grocery basket of, I've got an apple and an orange and a can of coconut milk and a pork chop. And an acquisitions editor is like, that's great, you have food. So what? I mean, what's the point? Whereas you want to be able to say, I have these ingredients and they all make a very, very specific meal. And these are how each of the ingredients contributes to making that meal. So that's kind of the way I would approach it.
I think that's a good way to describe. So I'm just to close, I'm going to read one comment because it speaks to so many people about the competition section. I like the expression competition. It sounds like you're entering a ring. So anyway, so this person was doing internship at University Press and read proposals, and the best ones mentioned recently published books that cover your topic and how and why your book is different than those.
Absolutely. No, I mean, I think that's exactly the sort of thing that you need to include. And I think, if you were writing, again, just to use the example, if you're writing about the, a history of electrification of something or other. Obviously you wouldn't point to Tom Hughes' Networks of Power as a book that you're in competition with because it's like 30 years old, but you might point to a couple more recent examples, and that would be a way of, indicating, again, not just competition, but also conversation. What is the space in which your book fits, and how is it not just competing with these books, but also how's it complementing them? And I think that's an important, another C word to include in this is it's not just conversation and competition, but also a complement. What does, if I look at my shelf on, books about electrification, how do these books fit together and form a larger picture? And, again, competition, maybe it was a poorly chosen word by my maybe I should have tempered that a little bit with conversation and complementarity, going back to quantum mechanics.
Thank you very much, Patrick. I think most of people here like several steps closer to publishing the first or second books. It was really very good talk. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
This has been a podcast from the Consortium for History of Science, Technology, and Medicine. For more information on this topic, as well as other podcasts, working groups, fellowships, and resources for learning, research, and teaching, please visit www.chstm.org.